add national language, it is take more time for the indigenous people want to register their script to register on the TLD level because there's different. Indonesian is use Latin language and the indigenous script is the not they not use the non-Latin script, so it's take times to developing and to make collaboration between the TLD and at the national level and the and TLD and the region level. I think it's maybe Jenny will be explore more about the detailed linguistic and this anthropologic side, but for me, is for now is about the difficulty to make from the national TLD and for the indigenous language who use non-Latin script.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you very much. And Edmon, your thoughts on the biggest challenges in implementing in Asia Pacific and the biggest lesson you've learned. I mean, DotAsia. That must have caused a number of lessons to be learned over the years. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So I guess I'll start by saying that I agree very much with Ram that this is really not just a technical issue, and we view and many of the technical issues has been overcome. And in fact, we're not only human, but it's a social issue. And come back to this. But before that, I wanted to mention something. You kind of frame the discussion around, we've been working on this for 20 years. I want to make sure that, people understand that it seems to be a very long time, in fact, but actually a lot of issues were dealt with over those 20 years. The first 10 years was the 10 years that moved the technology to where it is. The technical specifications and technical standards were being developed in the first 10 years. When I first got involved back in 1999, all the way until 2008 to 2009, when the technical issues were dealt with, because we're talking about very fundamental part of the internet infrastructure. And then we spent the last 10 years actually working on the policies that actually ensure that some of the issues, including security issues, including phishing, homoglyphic attacks, some of the issues that, in fact, even ASCII or English alphanumeric domains have not addressed, like the 0 and the O and the 1 and the L and the I. In the internationalized domain names or multilingual different language domains, some of the characters look so much alike that we actually have to address them in a policy level. So in the last 10 years, actually, ICANN and the community worked through most of the world's languages. And I know we're coming back to some of those that we're missing out, but it took a lot of time to work through the hundreds of languages, and we ended up to I think about 30 scripts that represents most of the live languages in the world today, and that takes time, and that was the last 20 years. But now back to your question is that now is the time to implement. And I think the biggest challenge really is a kind of, in my view, a kind of market failure. And why do I say that? Is because I do believe there's demand, but that demand is hidden. There's a latent demand because general users don't even know that they can use a Chinese domain name. They can use a Japanese or Korean domain name, and they're not asking for it from their providers. They're not asking for a Korean email address, for example. And that's the problem, I think. And that requires, when I guess in economics, when there is a market failure, there requires a kind of market intervention. And that's where some policies come into play. I personally think that when universal acceptance was really picked up by ICANN a few years ago, when ICANN, the organization, actually started down the path towards fully universal acceptance ready, that was a big change in the entire community's awareness towards it. And I think more of this needs to happen. And the final thing that I want to say is that besides market intervention, I think these things require, in my view, a kind of social movement. You know, we need an IDN movement. We need an IDN UA movement to push forward such that latent demand can be realized. People don't even know they can demand for an email address or domain name in their own native language. Then of course we don't see the demand, and of course the supply side is not, you know, really putting in the systems that are fully compliant. And sometimes half-assed implementation makes for the worse, you know, because, you know, it works here and then it doesn't work there, and then the trust gets, you know, diluted. And I think that's actually the biggest challenge we have right now, I think.
Thank you, Edmon. We'll come back to some of that in a little while. So, Jenny, I'd like to come to you. Talk a little about Indigenous language and history, and then I'm going to ask the other panelists to consider what can be done via the internet that might help to preserve and nurture Indigenous languages, many of which are spoken rather than written. So talk a little bit about those languages and the history for us, please.
Hi, everyone. My name's Jenny Fraser. I'm an Aboriginal person. I don't speak on behalf of all Aboriginal people because we're all sovereign people. Place where we are today, the language group that belongs to this land is called Jagera or Yagara. J or Y are the same words, similar to how they pronounce it in Mexico. And there's a mountain range just over this way, and that's where my people are from. And our tribe name is Yugambeh, and we're part of the Bundjalung Nation. So the Bundjalung consists of a lot of different dialects. So I'm not sure if you've thought about where you are at this time, but now it's called Queensland. And I'm wondering if you know why it might be called Queensland. If anyone's had any ideas. So even not many people in Australia know this or talk about this, but in 1859, Queen Victoria declared genocide on my people in the name of education and religion. So that's why it's called Queensland, because before we were all part of New South Wales, that colony. So we created our own colony called Queensland. And so basically, naming is powerful. And in Australia, we can use one word to replace many words. So we have hundreds of different dialects in Australia, and we can eradicate ever naming them again by calling them Aboriginal or Indigenous. The same way that we can name Australia on the internet as .au. We don't have to even say Australia. So it's a similar naming convention when you call people Aboriginal. And some people object to that word Aboriginal because it consists of original. But what is ab? Usually you use ab as a prefix, like abnormal, something that's not normal or something that's not original in this case. So yeah, as you may be aware, Australia was founded under the idea of terra nullius, which means no man's land, and consequently called Aboriginal people. So we had our own internet before white people came, and this is still in place in some areas of Australia. We call them song lines, where we can tell a story with a lot of specific Indigenous knowledges in that story, but sometimes that story or that song or that dance can take 3 days to tell. So if you wanted to know more about this, you could see a film called 10 Canoes, where they just tell one story, but that goes over a long period of time. Yeah, so I know about this founding of Queensland because when they started doing massacres along the border between Queensland and New South Wales, where I'm from, my granny was given as a courtesy to the native police officer who performed a massacre that night with other Aboriginal native police. So he was a white man from England, and she was given like as a trophy to him to say, from the pastoralist to say thank you. So after that, people were forced to live under the Act. And the Act, as we call it, is the Aboriginal Protection Act. So basically they were trying to protect Aboriginal people. Although it was under the guise of protection, but basically they were forbidden to speak their language, enact culture, sing their songs, dance, or anything like that. So it's no wonder that we find ourselves today in this place where we're on the top 10 list of endangered languages in the world, Yugambeh language. So a lot of people tend to look down on Aboriginal people if they don't speak their own language, but they're actually forbidden, and it was flogged out of them to do so. So some people view the English language as spelling, like it's casting spells, and I would tend to agree with that, because a lot of English words have really powerful consequence, especially for Aboriginal people. And so Ram wanted me to talk about languages because a lot of people who still live in regional and remote areas away from the colony of the East Coast have little choice. Like they might, if they're a language speaker, English might be their 5th or 6th language on the list of things that they have to learn. So these are all consequences that have to be dealt with when dealing with something like the internet as we know it.
Jenny, a lot of these languages are spoken languages, and although they can be written, they're written in ASCII characters. Is there any, are there any alphabets that those languages actually have that are their own alphabets, or are they only spoken and therefore sort of transliterated into the ASCII alphabet?
Yeah, so our language is a similar context to Indonesia that Juliana mentioned. So we just have an oral language which has been translated by anthropologists, and a lot of those are set in stone now, whereas languages used to be evolving. Now they're quite concrete. You know, you can't make much use of it outside of that. So yeah, it's all based on the English alphabet, and a lot of letters aren't spoken in Aboriginal languages, and some of them are more common than others. You know, like there's a lot of Ks, and in a lot of different dialects, a K and a G is the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. So from the point of view of putting together the technology, it may very well be that the representing and let's be clear, Australia is not the indigenous languages in Australia are not alone in the world as being challenged by being spoken only, and it may be that the technology is already there to deal with it. But Edmon, you talked about, in the context of internationalized domain names, you talked about universal acceptance, which is to do with making sure that the machinery can actually deal with inputs that are not the norm in the sense of that what they were built for, which is to be inputted in ASCII and in Latin languages. So that for example, your enrollment form for getting a parking permit allows you to input a text that is not just straightforward ASCII text. So it strikes me that maybe it may be the universal acceptance movement, for want of a better word, maybe one place that we could attempt to broaden what that is for, to involve the embracing of indigenous languages into the internet. Juliana, having listened to Jenny, do you want to make any comments about the indigenous languages and the way that they're represented on the net?
Okay, yeah. I think before the IDN implemented, some indigenous languages in Indonesia had tried to transform into the is similar with Latin script, so we can write and type in the Latin script with some action or some accent or some pronunciation. So it is more easier to develop in internet. But when IDN is implemented, so some indigenous languages want their local script, non-Latin script to be introduced to and implement to the internet. And I think it's become the bigger, not only Indonesia but in APAC, because the internet now is reaching the remote area, and some people in remote area is not using Latin as the daily as the language. So it is more open opportunity to reach out the indigenous people, to encourage them to implement their and to preserve their local script into internet. But again, it is need the time to transfer from the transcript and then to implement to the internet. So this is a challenge to explain them how to implement the local language in internet, and then how to deal with the security and it is make people, some people, there are some people who still eager to develop in the indigenous script into the internet, but some people still, because of time, because they need the more expertise to transcript from the indigenous script into the internet. So this they feel hesitate. So this is this is stop them to preserve their local script into the internet.
Thanks very much, Juliana. Ram, Edmon talked about universal acceptance, and effectively there being a market failure. Any thoughts about what sort of incentives there might be we could create, or that are already out there that may not be known, to encourage that hidden demand to be unveiled, and have the commercial embracement of IDNs effectively start to move?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think Edmon makes a provocative point, speaking about market failure. I look at it in perhaps a different way. I think that we are kind of missing the point if we speak about this as a failure of IDNs, or a failure of implementation of IDNs, or the acceptance of these IDNs. I think the real overarching problem that we have to solve and find incentives for is about digital inclusion. IDNs are a part of it. Universal acceptance is a part of it. But it really comes down to, how do you build an environment? How do you build an ecosystem that both encourages and rewards apps, websites, interfaces, systems that are inclusive of the many languages of the world, the many scripts in which these languages are represented, the many ways, the many sounds of the languages. How do you build a system that rewards that kind of inclusion? Education is the most obvious thing, and there's some level of work that's already going on in there. But there's also access, and one of the harder problems, and perhaps Chris, we can speak about that as a separate topic. One of the harder problems with expressing languages, other languages on the internet, which was originally built with the Latin script as the basis, is that in many other languages there is ambiguity that is built into it. When is a G, and when is it a K? When is a J, and when is it an H? Right? On the internet, in the Latin script model, there is no place for ambiguity. A G is always a G. A K is always a K. Right? So I think that some evolution is necessary in that area as well. But that's a separate topic. The fundamental reward system, I think, that has to be created is a reward system that provides a higher ranking on search engines or better placement at various sites if the app, if the website has digital inclusion integrated into it versus sites that do not do that. So I think that's an example. I also think that from a regulatory point of view, from governments, and this is an idea that Edmon and I have been advocating for a while, when procurement happens, I think it's such a terrific way to up-level everybody. When government tries to procure services, digital services, I think government could make it a requirement that whoever is a vendor who is applying for these services, they have to be UA ready. They have to ensure and demonstrate in a given amount of time that they have not just a strategy for digital inclusion, but a clear plan on when that'll get implemented. So it's a little bit of a carrot and a stick, but I think governments and other organizations that have large purchasing power and influence have the ability to move this needle, perhaps far more than just a campaign of persuasion.
Thanks, Ram. Interesting point. Edmon, pick up on that, given that you started the conversation about incentive. And talk a bit about Ram's comments around being universal acceptance ready, and specifically, is there a standard that I could have that I could adhere to? Are we working to create a standard that I could adhere to and have a badge on my website that says, ISO standard, whatever it is, for universal acceptance?
Thank you, Chris. And actually building on what Ram said, I agree very much. In fact, that's where I think at least it intersects with my belief nowadays, after working at it for 20 years, that we need a movement, and that movement needs to have a push for a wider acceptance, and digital inclusion is the right vehicle, I believe, for making this really happen. And speaking about universal acceptance, you mentioned whether there are codes or standards. I think the Universal Acceptance Steering Group, which actually Ram and I got started, did some work on it and has a definition for universal acceptance and some thresholds and criteria for different types of readiness. And I think that's a very good starting point. But coming back to its implementation, I wanted to say an interesting thing. I don't know, Ram, if you tried to sign up for the free Brisbane Airport Wi-Fi. When I signed up, it kicked out my .asia email address and saying that it was invalid.
Yeah, it kicked out my .info address, my .email address, my .digital address. So I ended up finally using my .au address.
Right. So these
well,
are
you should have used that in the first place, Ram. Clearly, I mean, you're in Australia.
Should have followed the country, right? I mean, okay. So
absolutely.
No, but that's
can I just interrupt you for 1 second, Edmon? Just 1 second, because that illustrates, I think, and you can talk to this, that illustrates a very important point, which is that universal acceptance is not just about internationalized domain names. It's actually about expanding the internet and the use of the internet beyond its original boundaries, where it was just CommonNet and org in the GTLD space and just two-letter top-level domains in the country code space. And now there are proper words at the top level in GTLDs, and in IDN CCTLDs, there are TLDs that have more than 2 characters. So I think that this universal acceptance movement that you suggested is not just about internationalized domain names, is it?
It definitely isn't, although internationalized domain names or and email addresses in their native language is a push. I think that is what Ram said ties it into digital inclusion, and that's what I think is going to make it happen. Of course, expanding the internet namespace is definitely important, and on that point of native languages, I wanted to highlight one thing actually, is that a lot of times people think about domain names and email addresses and think, oh, so they're just names, right? I mean, what you need for the multilingual internet and inclusion is actually content and services and so on, right? So, domain names, email address is just one thing. But I want to, remind people that actually, if you look at the history of the development of the internet, email addresses and the domain name system was put in place in 1983. 1983 was when the domain name system was put in place. That was ASCII and English only. It was all ready. The web was not invented until 1989, 6 years later. So the point about the identifiers and domain name and email addressing system being ready makes for the foundation of content to then come. Today, the web still has almost 60%, 57% last count of content in English. Billions of people don't speak English, or definitely not speak English in their native language, right? But the majority of the web is still English. I think the identifier system, the domain name system, and email addressing system plays a role. If we have the universal access ready and in the IDN and internationalized email addresses ready in the system, the content will have an infrastructure that it can be built on. So I think they come hand in hand, and the history can tell us something.
Fair enough. And I think that's right. I mean, it's all about bringing all of this together into one movement, as you've said. We talked a little bit about the policies. You mentioned it, Edmon, that a lot of the work over the last 20 years has been focusing on policies, and you talked about the IDN policies. Looking at areas that are not necessarily covered in ASCII GTLDs. Would you say, and Ram, perhaps you could tackle this first, would you say that the IDN policies that are being put in place are there because they're necessary and they don't apply to often don't apply to the ASCII GTLDs? Or is it just that because there's an opportunity to build it from the ground up properly, knowing how these things are used now, that actually the IDN policies are better than GTLD ones, ASCII GTLD ones? I'm talking about things like variants, and because in a GTLD, an ASCII GTLD, an I can be confused with an L, even they can be visually similar.
Yeah, I think because of the complexity of language and expressing language, in the DNS, I agree with the premise that IDN TLD policies are more expressive of how humans actually communicate with each other, as compared to ASCII GTLD policies. There is still a ways to go, but even the fact that you can accommodate both left to right and right to left, languages that you can accommodate, symbolic languages, all of those things, and the fact that in some of the languages, as you said, Chris, what you write in one way or in one script is it means identical, the same thing written in another script. And Chinese is a pretty good example of it. And you need to find a way to tie the two of them together so that there is not confusion, right? So it's a much richer repertoire of policies in the IDN TLD world, and the IDN world in general compared to the ASCII world.
I guess I'm happy to add on that. So
go ahead, Edmon. Yes, please do.
Just to add on that, I don't think IDN policies add to that. In fact, I think it's I think ASCII top-level domains also address that. I mean, for ASCII TLDs, it is just not documented in a technical way or techno-policy way. It's the policy is to not have confusingly similar top-level domains. So an I and an L interchangeable for the TLD would probably not be accepted as well. But going back to I guess building what Ram said, it's really the kind of policies that is a linguistic and component. The one that I'm most familiar with is Chinese, and there are different ways of writing a Chinese character. It's almost like the capital letter A and the small letter A. In the ASCII world, that's mapped together by technology standards. Unfortunately, the IDN standards were unable to do that because it wasn't a straightforward one-to-one mapping. Therefore, policies need to be put in place to map these basically a same character back together. And that's where those policies come into play. So I don't think it's, it's more or less, I think the time it took was longer because the issues were more complex. But I think we're I wouldn't say done with it because languages are living things. But we are in a position that we can roll these things out.
One thing that I think is interesting.
Sorry, Ram, go ahead.
Sorry, Chris. One thing that is interesting in all of this is much of the technological focus has been on written languages. And I'm really intrigued, when Jenny was talking about the oral languages, and there's a rich history there. And it's not just that those languages are endangered in the world. I think actually all oral languages, unless there is some focus on it, I think all oral languages are a danger of being digitally erased because there is no method for oral languages to be expressed on the internet other than transliteration into English or the Latin script. And in Africa, it's not even the Latin script. In Africa, it is the Arabic script.
Yes, exactly. And I think thank you for bringing that up, Ram. Pat Kane has put a comment into the chat, which I think takes us into an area that I'd like us to wander into. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we could go deep into the weeds on technical stuff, but that's probably not desperately helpful. And what Pat says in the chat is, the question for me is, how do you preserve cultures whose languages that are unwritten or includes tonal characters, such as the clicks in many African languages? How do you preserve those on the internet, or even reconstitute extinct or near extinct languages, such as Cornish, which is a language spoken in the south of England that is, I think now there are about fewer than 300 speakers of Cornish. So maybe we'll go to Jenny in a minute, but Juliana, let's start with you and just say, what are your thoughts about how could we work to preserve these cultures and languages that are unwritten on the internet? It's not about internationalized domain names, but it is about different languages and different ways of communicating. Any thoughts about how we could help to do that?
Yes, me or Jenny. Okay, I think some Wikipedia has started Wikipedia, and some community language related with Wikipedia has doing some great working to document it, the oral language, indigenous language who can be translated into the digitalized or non-ASCII code. We can do. I think when we wait for the technical or the technology is ready for some language who can translate into the digital, into the internet. So the documentation, like the recorded, place in internet, and the scan script, and then and they can place the script and digitalize and record it into some website people can learn and hearing about the local language. But I think this is what the indigenous language community do for now to preserve their local language. Meanwhile, waiting for the technical readiness when they can translate their language script into the internet. Yeah.
Thanks, Juliana. Jenny, do you think that the internet can be a useful tool to help preserve some of the indigenous languages around the world, including in Australia? And is doing that simply by transliterating, putting them into an alphabet, a written alphabet of use, or would we be better off to concentrate solely on the verbal and the sound? What are your thoughts on that, Jenny?
So our tribe, Yugambeh, have taken up technology very well. Like they've got apps for the language. So 20 years ago, 23 years ago, I learnt our language. And at the time, it was at such a state that I couldn't form sentences. So basically, they just taught us some words and taught us how to research. Basically, just you're on your own, go and sort it out. So even if I wanted to talk to other people and learn structures, I couldn't. And so I'm not really a speaker. So I understand some words, but there's younger people now who have learnt the language from their old people, and they teach now. So if I ask them a question, they will respond to me with audio. So they'll send me a Facebook message or a text with a recorded message in it so that I know the correct pronunciation. And so that is a problem with technology as well as with the apps and the internet, is that some of the words are mispronounced. And so now they're being perpetuated in the wrong way. So the old people don't even recognize their own language on the internet because it's not right.
Yeah. But clearly that said, but clearly there is a role for memorializing and developing indigenous spoken languages using the internet as a dissemination tool, be it through audio or through or through the written word. Would you say that's right? That there is a role?
It is supposed to be a dissemination tool, but people treat it like it's the be all and end all. So if it's on the internet, then it must be the truth. And that's tragic for languages, I think.
Not just for languages, Jenny, for a whole heap of other things as well. But But yes, agreed. All right, we've got a few minutes left, and I'd like to try and bring us back a little bit just to the sort of overarching IDN topic. And I suppose my question is, what do we think are the untapped opportunities that IDNs can help to realize? You know, what if you could choose one, if you think one thing that sort of universal acceptance and the availability of IDN around the world could do, or one opportunity rather. Does anyone have any thoughts about what that might be? Ram?
Thanks, Chris. I think one of the untapped opportunities is the way humans interact and interface with the internet is still primarily through text. You know, it's written in some way. You have to type something into a browser or into an app. And I think there's a great untapped opportunity in a greater role of voice and the spoken word in engaging and interacting with the internet. And what I mean is this. Today, you can go to a search engine and you can speak into your phone, and you can say, you can ask it to search something, and the search engine understands what to do about it. But you cannot do the equivalent thing on the domain name system or using a website. And I think there's a great untapped opportunity to be able to directly interact with the internet as we know it, the domain name system websites, using the spoken word.
Thank you, Ron. That's actually a really interesting thought. Sort of a Siri or an Alexa for the web. Interesting. Edmon, do you have any thoughts about untapped opportunities in the IDN world?
I can't agree with Ram more. It would be very weird for a Japanese in Japan holding on his phone and trying to access a website and speaking English, right? I mean, it's just strange. And that's definitely a very important part. And earlier I mentioned, and I think it's still the biggest area, is to really level the field in terms of the content online. Again, still almost 60% of the web is English. That's just not right. It's not reflecting of the general culture. And especially if you think about AI, and which is a hot topic, and you think forward, the machine learning looking at the web today would obviously have bias, right? I mean, if the world is not 60% English, then that is simply a fundamental bias. So with I think the universal acceptance, with internationalized domain names and email addresses in place, I see that as unleashing the content of the web to be in a more reflective of the demographics and the linguistic community around the world as well. And that, I think, is a big opportunity, not just as a commercial opportunity, but an opportunity for that kind of more multicultural worldview on the web to actually happen.
Thank you very much, Edmon. I can't actually see the room, so I don't know whether there's anybody in the room that wants to ask a question. We have a couple of minutes left if there is anybody. Perhaps somebody.
Yeah, there is a hand raised. Would you like to come to the microphone?
Go.
I'm just wondering whether this discussion is relevant at all. And I don't belong to this camp, but let's assume the splinternet issue. Do you think if that happens, this would be a question at all, or you think it will solve this whole problem? I'm sorry, I'm just being provocative.
It's actually quite an interesting question.
You still have to communicate.
If you splinter it.
No, I actually think it's a good question. In my view, not having a universal acceptance, not being able to put internationalized domain names in place, is part of splintering, is part of fragmenting the internet, because then part of the internet is not accessible, or part of the people who speak a different, a language that if they're not familiar with English, they are kept out. That's a kind of fragmentation as well. But if you talk about the fundamental fragmentation in terms of the infrastructure of the internet, I think universal acceptance play an even more important role, because without universal acceptance, the trust to the DNS, today we trust the DNS, but in the world where universal acceptance is not well deployed, then some of the domain names or email addresses can work here and cannot work there. That is a fundamental fragmentation of the internet in my mind.
I think that's probably right, Edmon. I also think that it brings up the difference between words, and in fact, Jenny, as Jenny said, naming is important. The bit between fragmentation and the splinternet. The splinternet, the fragmentation is a much wider problem to deal with, because it can be fragmented in you can't have access to it, that means it's fragmented and so on, whereas a splinternet is very much more to do with I'm just going to take my bit of the internet and go away and splinter from the main thing. But a very interesting question, I think. We are rapidly running out of time here. I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and that is 100% down to you four. So perhaps the audience in the room and those online could join me in thanking Juliana, Jenny, Ram, and Edmon for their contributions today. And I hope everybody has enjoyed the panel. Thank you very much indeed.
And I just have a couple of housekeeping notes now, putting my APrIGF hat on. So this session is over, but the next session that will happen here in this room is the town hall. So please bring the discussion that we just had back to the synthesis document. Is a very important vehicle for APrIGF. You can also check the online, the comments.aprigf.asia. And the town hall will start at 1600, that's 4 p.m. Which means in 20 minutes time. So see you all in 20 minutes.
Recording stopped.